Chapter 5 of Frigid Fracas by Mack Reynolds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Dale Grothman. A servant took Joe Mauser's cap at the door and requested that Joe follow him. Joe trailed behind on the way to the living room of the mansion, somewhat taken aback by the, to him, ostentation of the display of luxuries of yesteryear. Among them was to be numbered the butler. Servants, other than military batmen, were simply not in Joe's world. Only the uppers were in a position to utilize the full time of individuals. Long years past, those tasks which once called for servants had been automated, from automated elevators to automated babysitters. The servant announced him, and then seemingly disappeared in the brief moment while Joe was bowing formally over Nadine Hare's hand. Even while murmuring the appropriate banalities, Joe wondered how one acquired the ability to seemingly disappear once one's services were no longer needed. Every man to his own trade, he decided. He had a date with Nadine, but it turned out that the piquant upper was not alone. In fact, it was obvious that she had not yet got around to dressing for her appointment with Joe. He had promised to take her soaring in his sailplane. She was attired, as always, as those who dress have never considered the cost of clothing. And, as ever, when Joe saw her newly, after a period of days or more away, he was taken with her intensity and her almost brittle beauty. What was it that the aristocrat seemed able to acquire after but a generation or two of what they were pleased to call reading? That aloof quality, that exquisite gentility. "Joe," she said, "you'll be pleased to meet Philip Howard, category government, rank secretary. Phil, Major Joe Mauser." The other, possibly 40, shook hands firmly and looked into Joe's face. He had a crisp manner. "Good heavens, yes," he said. "That remarkable innovation of using the engineless aircraft for reconnaissance. My old friend Marshal Cogswell was speaking of it the other day. I assume that in advance you purchase stock in the firms which manufacture such craft, Major. They must be booming." Joe grimaced wryly. "No, sir. I was not smart enough to think of that. Professional soldiers are traditionally stupid. What was the old expression? They can take their shirts off without unbuttoning their collars." Philip Holland cocked his head, even as he chuckled. "I detect a note of bitterness, Major." Nadine said airily, "Joe has ambitions, thinking the answer to all his problems lie in jumping his caste to upper." Joe looked at her impatiently to where she sat on the mid-20th century type sofa. Philip Holland said, "Possibly he's right, my dear. Each of us have different needs to achieve such happiness as is possible to man." To Joe, he sounded just vaguely on the stuffy side, even through the crispness. By nature nervous and quick-moving, Holland seemed to try and project an air of calm which didn't quite come off. Joe wondered what his relationship to Nadine could be. A twinge of jealousy there. But that was ridiculous. Nadine must be in the vicinity of 30. Obviously, she knew, and had known, many men as attracted to her as was Joe Mauser, and men in her own caste, at that. Somehow, though, he felt Holland was no upper. The others simply didn't have the air. Joe said to him, "Nadine doesn't get my point. I contend that in a strata-divided society, it's hard to realize yourself fully until you're a member of the upper caste. Admittedly, perhaps you won't, even if you are such a member, but at least you haven't the obstacles with which the lower class, or classes, are beset." "Interestingly stated," Holland said briskly. He returned to his chair from which he had arisen to shake hands with Joe, and looked at Nadine. "You said on introducing us that Joe would be glad to meet me, my dear. Why especially?" Nadine laughed. "Because I've been practicing your arguments upon him." Both of the men frowned at her. Nadine looked at Joe. "Phil Holland's the most interesting man I know, I do believe. He's secretary to Marlowe Mannerheim, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and simply couldn't be more privy to the inner workings of government. It was Phil who convinced me that something was wrong with our socioeconomic system." "Oh," Joe said. He wasn't really interested. Let society solve its problems. He had his own, and they were sufficient unto themselves as well as the day thereof. However, conversation has to be kept moving. He needled the other. "I've heard it contended that any type of government is good given capable, intelligent personnel to run it, or bad if not so managed. What was the example I read somewhere? Both heaven and hell are despotisms." Phil Holland shrugged. "An interesting observation. However, institutions, including socio-political ones, can become outdated. When they do, no matter how intelligent, capable, and honest the governmental heads, that socio-political system can be a hell. If at such time there are capable, intelligent persons available, they will take such measures as are necessary to change the institutions." Nadine came to her feet. "The subject is my favorite, but I must change. Joe is taking me a gliding, and I'm sure this frock isn't de rigueur. You gentlemen will excuse me?" She was off before they had time to come to their feet. Joe Mauser settled himself again, crossing his legs. He said idly, "And you think our basic institutions have reached the state of needing change?" "Perhaps, although as a member of the government category, it should hardly be my position to advocate such." He seemed to switch subjects. "Have you read much of the Roman ludi, the games, as we call them?" "The gladiators and such?" Joe shrugged. "I've read a bit about them. It's been pointed out, in fact, by Dr. Hare among others, that basically our present-day fracases serve the same purpose. That instead of bread and circuses provided by the Roman patricians to keep the unemployed Roman mob from becoming restive, we give them trank pills and televiolence." Holland nodded. "But that isn't the point I was making right now. What I was thinking was that the first Roman games were athletic affairs without bloodshed. It wasn't until 264 BC that 3 pairs of slaves were sent to fight with swords. By 183 BC, the number had gone to 60 pairs. By 145 BC, 90 pairs fought for 3 days. But that was just the beginning. They really got underway with the dictators. Sulla put 100 lions into the arena, but Julius Caesar topped that with 400, and Pompey then had 600, plus over 400 leopards and 20 elephants. Augustus beat them all with 3,500 elephants and 10,000 men killed in a series of games. But it was the emperors who really expanded the Ludi. Trajan had 10,000 animals killed in the arena to celebrate his victory over the Dacians, not to mention 11,000 people, not to speak of hippopotami, tigers, lions, and leopards. Few people realize the extent to which the Romans went to acquire exotic animals to be slaughtered for the edification of the mob. They penetrated as far south as Kenya. There are still the ruins of a Roman fort there. As far east as Indonesia, as far north as the Baltic, and there is even evidence that they brought polar bears from Iceland. Phil Holland snorted, as though in contempt. But the mob wearied of even such spectacles as giraffes being killed by pygmies from the Yturbi forest. The game started as fights between skilled swordsmen being observed by knowledgeable combat soldiers of a warrior people. But as the Romans lost their warlike ardor and became a worthless mob performing no useful act for either themselves or the state, they no longer appreciated a drawn-out duel between equals. They wanted quick blood and lots of it, and turned to mass slaughter of Christians, runaway slaves, criminals, and whoever else they could find to throw to the lions, crocodiles, or whatever. Even this became old hat, and they turned increasingly to more extreme sadism. Children were hung up by their heels, and animals turned loose to pull them down. Men were tied face to face with rotting corpses, and so remained until death. Animals were taught to rape virgins. Joe Mauser stirred again. What in Zen was this long monologue on the Roman games leading to? Holland said, "By the way, contrary to some belief, the games didn't end upon Christianity becoming the dominant faith and finally the state religion. Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 AD, but it wasn't until 365 that Valentinian passed a law against sacrificing humans to animals in the arena, and the gladiator schools remained in operation until 399. The arenas were finally closed in 404 AD, but by that time the Roman Empire was a mockery. In all, they lasted more than half a millennium, but things move faster these days." The tone of voice changed abruptly, and Holland snapped a question at Joe. "By your age, I would imagine you've participated in present-day fracases for some 15 years. How have they changed in that time?" Joe was taken aback. "Why," he said, hesitated as he got the other's point, then went on, nodding. "Yes, they used to be a company size, a few hundred lads involved. After a while, a battalion-size fracas became fairly commonplace. Then, about 10 years ago, a corporation of any size had to be able to put at least a regiment onto the field, and the biggies had brigades." "And now?" Holland urged. "Now a divisional-size fracas is the thing." "Yes, and if the corporation isn't among the top dozen or so, a single defeat can mean bankruptcy." Joe nodded. He had known of such cases. Holland leaned back in his chair, as though all his points had been made. He said, his voice less brisk, "Our people's capitalism, our welfare state, took the road of bringing the equivalent of the Roman ludi to keep our people in a state of stupefied acceptance of the status quo. And, as in the case of Rome, the games are bankrupting it. Our present-day patrician classes, our uppers, have a tiger by the tail, Joseph Mauser, and can't let go. We need those capable and intelligent people of whom you spoke earlier to make some basic changes. Where are they? Nadine says that your great driving ambition is to jump to upper in caste. But even if you make it, what will you have on your hands but these problems that the uppers seem unable to solve?" Joe said impatiently, "Possibly you're right. What you say about the fracases becoming bigger and more expensive is true. They're also becoming bloodier. In the old days, a corporation or a union going into a fracas was conscious of having a high casualty list among the mercenaries. Highly trained soldiers cost money. Insurance, indemnity, pensions, all the rest of it. Consequently, you'd fight a battle of movement, maneuver, brainwork on the part of the officer commanding, so that practically nobody was hurt on either side. One force or the other would surrender after being caught in an impossible situation. Not anymore. These days they want blood, plenty of blood, and they want the telecameras to focus right into the middle of it." Joe shook his head. "But it's not my problem to solve. I've got my goal. I'll worry about other ones when I've achieved it." A voice behind him was supercilious. "I do believe it's a status-hungry captain, that is, major these days. To what do I owe this unexpected visit, Major Mauser?" Joe came to his feet and faced the newcomer, Philip Holland doing the same, somewhat more leisurely. Baron Balt Haer, wearing a colonel's uniform and flickering his swagger stick along his booted leg, stood in the doorway. His voice was lazily arrogant. "And, Mr. Holland, I must say the middle caste seem to have taken over the house. Well, Major Mauser, I assume you do not labor under the illusion that you are welcome in this dwelling." In category military, rank is observed whilst in uniform, even though neither individual is currently on active service. Joe had automatically come to attention. He said stiffly, "Sir, I am calling upon your sister, Dr. Haer." "Indeed," Baron Haer said, his nostrils high in that attitude once perfected by the grandees of medieval Spain, landed gentry of England, and Prussian junkers. "I find that my sister, in her capacity as a medical scientist, seems to go to extremes in her research. What aspect of the lower classes is she studying in your case, Major?" Joe flushed. "Baron Hare," he said, "we seem to have gotten off on the wrong foot when we participated in that fracas against Continental hovercraft under your father, the late Baron. I would appreciate an opportunity to start over again." "Would you indeed?" Balt Hare said loftily. He turned his eyes to Philip Holland, whose mouth bore the slightest suggestion of suppressed humor. "Unless I'm mistaken, the conversation at the time of my entry seemed to have a distinctly subversive element. Shouldn't this be somewhat surprising in a secretary of the administration's foreign ministry?" Philip Holland said crisply, "You must have intruded, that is, entered at the end of a sentence, Baron Hare. We were merely discussing the various methods down through the ages that ruling classes have utilized to perpetuate themselves in power." Hare obviously disbelieved him. He said, "For example?" "There are many examples," Holland said, reseating himself. "For instance, the medieval feudal classes, who dominated the ignorant and highly superstitious serfdom, soon found it expedient to add to their titles, 'by the grace of God,' as though it was God's wish that they be count, or baron, or prince, or king. What serf would dare attempt to overthrow his lord in the face of God's wishes?" "I see," Balt Hare said. "And other examples?" Holland shrugged. "The Chinese mandarins utilized possibly the most unique method of a governing class perpetuating itself ever known, certainly one of the most gentle." Hare was scowling at him, obviously out of his depth, as was Joe Mauser for that matter. Holland said crisply, "The mandarins devised a written language so complicated that it took at least 10 years to master reading and writing, thus assuring that only the very well-to-do could afford to educate their sons. When invaded, as so often China has been invaded, only the mandarins were in a position to serve the conquerors by carrying on the paperwork so vital to any advanced society. So, still in control of the machinery of government, they continued to perpetuate themselves, and shortly, as history is reckoned, we found the conquerors assimilated and the mandarins still in power." Balt Hare said impatiently, "I seemed to be under the impression that you were speaking of more current times when I entered, Mr. Holland." From the door, Nadine said, "Good heavens, Balt, are you badgering my guests again?" The three men faced her. Balt said nastily, "I'm astonished that you persist in bringing members of the lower orders into my home, Nadine." "Our home, Balt. In fact, if you must bring up such matters before outsiders, you will recall that you converted your portion of the family estate into Continental hovercraft stock shortly before Father met Baron Zwerdling's forces in the recent fracas. No wonder you dislike Major Mauser. Through his efforts, our company won, rather than losing, as you had expected." Her brother, who could have been only slightly her senior, was obviously enraged. "Are you suggesting that I am not welcome to stay in this, our family home, simply because the property is in your name?" "Not at all," she sighed. "You are always at home here, Balt. I simply demand that you exercise common courtesy to my guests." He turned and walked stiff-kneed from the room. "Sorry," Joe said to Nadine. "Why?" she said simply. "The fact of the matter is that Balt and I are continually at each other. He is quite the active member of the Nathan Hale Society." Joe frowned his ignorance and looked at Holland. Holland chuckled. "An ultra-conservative, reactionary might be a better term, organization devoted to witch hunting and such in its efforts to maintain the status quo, Major. Once again, history repeats itself. Such groups invariably evolve when basic change threatens the socioeconomic system." He looked at Nadine. "I must be going, my dear. My, how charming you look. If this is the customary garb whilst going a-gliding, I shall have to take up the sport." "Why, Phil, inane words of flattery from serious old you. Joe squirmed inwardly, wondering again upon what basis was the friendship of Nadine Hare and Philip Holland. The butler entered and said, "A call for Major Mauser, if you please." Only Max Mance, his batman during his last fracas, and now permanently attached to Joe, knew that he might be found at this address. Joe said to Nadine, "Would you pardon me for a moment? I assume it's something important, or I wouldn't be disturbed." She said demurely, "Undoubtedly one of the feminine members of the Joe Mauser Buff Club." He snorted amusement and followed the butler to the library and the telescreen. Max Mance's face loomed in the viewing screen. As soon as Joe appeared, he said, "Major, sir, the marshal's been trying to get a hold of you ever since you left the hotel." "The marshal?" Joe scowled. "Marshal Cogswell, that one they call Stonewall Cogswell. And when he wants somebody, he really wants 'em. And I've got a feeling it's a good idea to come on the double." Joe laughed. "Stonewall Cogswell's a tough one, all right, Max." "You ain't just counting down, Major, sir. He said when I get hold of you to come over to his headquarters soonest." "All right, Max, thanks." Joe flickered the set off. Actually, Max was right. You didn't ignore a summons from Marshal Cogswell, not if you were in category military and ambitious. The date with Nadine was off. And just when he was beginning to detect signs of her meeting him on his own level. Are you surprised at my memory? The subject has always fascinated me. For one thing, I am a great believer in the theory that history repeats itself. As time went on, arenas were built all over the empire. Even small towns boasted their own. In Rome, the number of them grew so that eventually an avid follower could attend every day, the year round. And as they increased in quantity, they also had to grow more extreme to hold the fans' attention. The Emperor Philip, in celebrating the 1000th anniversary of the founding of Rome, had killed 1,000 pair of gladiators, a rhinoceros, 6 hippopotami, 10 hyenas, 10 giraffes, 20 wild asses, 10 tigers, 10 zebras, 30 leopards, 60 lions, 32 elephants, 40 wild horses. I'm afraid I forgot the rest." Joe stirred in his chair. The other's personality grew on him. The crisp voice had a certain magnetic quality that made what he said important somehow. However, Joe's interest in Roman history wasn't exactly paramount. Holland said, "You wonder at what I am driving, eh? Do you realize the expense involved in getting a rhinoceros to Rome in those days?" The end of Chapter 5. Recorded by Dale Grothman.